Thanks so much, George, and really appreciate the invitation to join as moderator for this panel. And we have a fantastic panel. I think folks are really going to enjoy this conversation. It's going to build on a lot of the points and observations that were made this morning about value and how to think about value in the context of therapies and diagnostics for Alzheimer's disease. This panel actually is, you're going to hear straight from folks from the health technology assessment and payer community, and their perspectives on the issues around assessing value and making recommendations for market access decisions. One of the things, just a kind of an opening comment, as folks know, the whole field of health technology assessment, which is the kind of the technical analysis that is the basis for market access, coverage, and reimbursement decisions. Within the definition of health technology assessment is the stated goal of promoting equitable and efficient and high quality healthcare, which are obviously massively important goals. And as soon as you begin to unpack that, you realize that there's huge challenges that underlie the responsibility for trying to achieve those goals in the healthcare system. One of the implications is, and almost an assumption underlying health technology assessment and market access and coverage decisions in most of the world, is the idea that relying on scientific evidence as a basis for decision making is critical. And the challenge is that scientific evidence itself is a matter that is a subject of huge debate in terms of what constitutes adequate evidence for decision making. And of course, you saw that play out dramatically in the recent aducanumab advisory committee meeting of the FDA, where the FDA staff, looking at the same evidence as their expert advisory committee, came to very different conclusions about whether the evidence was adequate, even in the context of regulatory decision making. So, this whole notion of HTA as a scientific enterprise brings us straight into some enormous challenges in terms of interpretation of evidence, and that's before you even get into the much more dramatic challenges of that have been discussed this morning about, well, what are the features of value? What constitutes the different elements of effectiveness and value that need to be taken into account for these access decisions? So we hope to get into all of those questions and issues with the panel this morning, and I think you'll see that we have some extraordinarily experienced and talented people to help us think through this. So why don't we then meet our panel? And I believe we're starting with Mike Adelberg, and we'll go from there. So Mike, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure getting a chance to speak with you all today. So I'm Mike Adelberg. I'm a colleague of Deborah Lappin, who was on the last panel. I'm a consulting principal at Faegre, Drinker, Biddle, and Reith, where I've been for the last 6 years. I have a practice that focuses on health plans in the U.S. market and innovations to the healthcare system. Also spent 15 years at CMS, the same agency mentioned where Sean spent some time, and I held senior positions in the Medicare program and in the part of the agency charged with bringing up the U.S. Affordable Care Act, or sometimes known as Obamacare. Also spent 3 years at a U.S. health plan where I was the vice president for product development. And I believe next up to introduce himself is Randy Krakauer.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I spent the last 20 years of my primary career in medical management, for the last 13 years of which I was the chief medical officer for Medicare at Aetna. I retired. I'm now retired. I do some consulting, but I'm on the faculty at the Rutgers Institute for Health Policy. And I also have a strong family history of Alzheimer's, and I'm 71 years old. So there is some personal connection here too. Now I'll pass it on to Brian O'Rourke.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Sean, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. I've spent the last 11 years as the President and Chief Executive Officer of CADIT, which is an HTA agency in Canada. And while at CADIT, I was very heavily involved in the global HTA community. I spent 4 years as the board chair for the International Network of Agencies for Health Technology Assessment. Prior to that, of course, I spent some time as a clinical pharmacist, as a procurement specialist for pharmaceuticals and medical devices, and as a payer. So my expertise is really in the HTA community. I did retire from CADIT in July, but I'm continuing to participate as the chair of the HTA Council for ISFOR, a member of the International Advisory Board for Singapore's HTA agency, and as the chair of the HTA Secretariat at the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences. So expertise in HTA, but today I'm going to be taking the perspective of the payer. And oh yes, I'm turning it over to, I'm very excited because I've never served on a panel with two O'Rourkes before. Over to Diana O'Rourke.
Thank you, Brian, and no relation, but thank you for the opportunity for participating today. So I'm Diana O'Rourke. I'm a senior analyst in the Science Policy and Research Programme at NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, the HTA body for England. And I have worked mainly across different European research funding projects, providing HTA perspective and into projects and research that's been undertaken. So primarily in the Alzheimer's field, the Roadmap project, which was around real-world outcomes and developing the platform for developing real-world outcomes. And currently working on a project called Neuronet, which is around collaboration and synergies across a range of neurodegenerative disease projects, and in particular around HTA and regulatory input and experience into that project. Prior to that, I worked within public health guideline development at NICE, and also looking at clinical guidelines and looking at new evidence and the impact of new evidence on guideline recommendations. So I will leave it there and I shall pass over to Anja. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. My name is Anja Schiel. I work at the Norwegian Medicines Agency, which is one of the agencies in Europe that does both the regulatory approval and the HTA work in one organization. I also used to be the chair of the Biostatistic Working Party at EMA, and I'm currently the chair of the Scientific Advice Working Party. So I see a lot of proposals on upcoming drugs, including all the potential problems that might come with them. I'm a statistician, or rather a methodologist, which is more accurately describing what we most of the time do. I have a background in biology and medical research, and I was also involved together with Diana. I was as a scientific advisor within the Roadmap project, and this explains why I've been following the field of Alzheimer's for a couple of years now, trying to untangle the upcoming problems and what might be solutions for the future, even though I feel that I have not necessarily made as much progress as most of the patients would probably hope for. And I'll hand back to Sean.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, as you can see, it's an incredibly experienced panel from whom we'll get a lot of rich and diverse perspectives. And so I think to start us off, I have sort of an open-ended question for all of the panelists, which is, as you look forward towards the availability, regulatory approval of a first disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease, from your perspective, what do you see as being sort of the most significant challenges related to the health technology assessment and payment decision-making around those products? Or another way of asking this question is, what is it that keeps you up at night when you think about the coming approval of disease-modifying therapies in Alzheimer's disease? And we'll mix up the order just for to keep things fresh. So how about Diana? Are you happy to go first on this?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Sean. I think for me, the issue that strikes me as being the most problematic is that from an HTA perspective, we need to be able to effectively measure the kind of long-term value of a new treatment for AD. And there's still a real great deal of uncertainty around the outcomes and impacts of the disease at different stages of the disease spectrum. And I think it was touched on earlier around kind of data and the need for data and lack of data at different stages. And this was something we picked up in the roadmap project, that when we mapped the AD outcomes at different stages of the disease, we could see that there were some real gaps in terms of real world data that was available, which could be used to support HTA submissions in the future. And I think that's still an issue going forward, that the lack of good quality data and what's needed for an HTA assessment. And I think that's still an issue. Sort of thinking about how we can outcomes that are tracked in a clinical trial scenario and how they differ from real world data, and how do we measure and track progression going forward if we were thinking about using, for example, say managed entry agreements. There's uncertainty around what sort of data we would need for those as well. So for me, I think that's the kind of main issue really for me, that considering the data availability and how we can really demonstrate long-term value for any new products that are coming forward.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, my screen froze a little bit there, so which is why there might have been a little bit of a pause. So apologies. So thanks, Diana. And
John,
can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Great. And so I think that's a hugely important point, just about, as particularly as folks were emphasizing some of the impacts of therapies on, and the importance of things like caregiver quality of life, or the longer term impacts on, let's say, the time to admission to nursing homes, are obviously outcomes that are tremendously difficult to be able to gather in regulatory trials. So just highlighting that those are the sorts of things where going to be critical to think about augmenting the evidence base. Yeah,
certainly.
Perfect. Okay, Randy, you up for going next?
Sure. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, some of the things that would concern us. First of all, the first disease-modifying product available will be looked at differently than subsequent products when we start looking at the relative value. But as far as the first product is concerned, clearly it's going to be something that's it's going to be important to implement. But there's some crucial questions. The data that's going to be available, as is not unusual, will be perhaps less than one would like to make optimal decisions, and we're going to be making decisions based on long-term prospects when we don't really have long-term data. And we'll have to do the best we possibly can. Also, and just as important, is going to be how it's going to be implemented, the populations that will be most appropriate, how different populations may respond to this approach, and the milieu in which it will be implemented. Some situations, such as advanced illness and palliative care, have been best implemented in the context of some robust case management, which, if not available at the site of care, is generally provided, at least in our context, by care managers who may be on site and may be telephonic, to provide support for the individuals, the caregivers, and robust advice on some of the details. It's very likely that this implementation is going to require a level of support, which in many cases payers are in a good position to provide. This will involve identifications of populations, identifications of subpopulations, and what type of care management might best be employed, and what kind of training this will require. So in this context, there's still a lot of work after the approval is given And there is also, of course, an opportunity for errors, which could result in, to put it charitably, less than optimal implementation, which is of some concern. So, from the payer perspective, at least in a great many cases, approval will be the beginning of a process which could be which can have pitfalls and for which we'll have to be careful. Thank you.
Yeah, great, Randy. I think that's really important point that I haven't heard raised quite as much. But all of this once the products become available, sort of all the surrounding care management strategies and efforts to ensure that the optimal outcomes are achieved given the therapy's inherent properties. So let's, Mike, probably a slightly different perspective that you'll bring to this, and eager to hear that.
Okay, well, thanks, Sean. And I want to build on Randy's comments. And the U.S. market is fractured in how it delivers healthcare, and so we have an entity, Medicare, and its agents and contractors covering the healthcare costs. We have a separate government program, Medicaid, financing much of the long-term care costs. And then building on comments from the previous panel, we have unpaid family caregivers doing a great deal of the custodial cost care and bearing those unpaid burden at home. And figuring out the true cost of the disease and then the costs that are avoided by a successful treatment and financing it appropriately and having the different entities in position to save money, assist in the burden of the cost is a tremendous policy challenge and methodological challenge, ultimately one that we want to take on, but a real challenge to think about because the U.S. system is so fractured.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful to add that perspective, and maybe we can come back later and talk a little bit about your thoughts about ways of addressing that challenge. But right now, we're just looking into the things that keep you awake at night, not what's going to put you back to sleep. So let's go to Anja next, and a very unique perspective as being both coming from a regulatory as well as a HTA payer perspective. So eager to hear your thoughts.
Thanks. Yes, I think we already heard the worst case scenario is potentially that the first drug that comes along has what we would not necessarily consider robust data. It comes with a data evidence set that is really struggling with lots of uncertainties. And uncertainties are usually really for all stakeholders. So it's not just a problem of regulators or the HTAs. Patients also have certain ideas on what kind of information they need. And not all trials will deliver to those needs, I would say. So I think what keeps me awake at night is the fact that I know for sure that the patients will consider us as a blocking institution to their access. When it is very difficult from our side to explain why the job we have to do isn't so easy. And it's not enough that somebody comes and says, I have beautiful data, please trust me. Because it's not about trust, it's about facts and evidence. And so the questions are really like, how can we contextualize when we don't even have a good understanding of the disease itself and what disease modification actually means? And it means different things to everybody. It means different things to regulators than it means to HTAs or patients. And how can we model something that we don't fully understand? So what is the value of even good data when it can't be considered relevant for the national setting? And I think Diana knows exactly. She looks at the UK patient and I look at the Norwegian patient, and every European agency does exactly the same, which brings me to Mike's comment. You feel that the US payment system is fractioned. I welcome you to come and talk to the HTA fraction system in Europe, which is a lot more complicated to navigate than I think the payment system in the US. So how do you handle these? And in the end, it's really, we have to assign value and we can discuss, I think, value for hours in any panel. What is value? Who decides what value is? But it's very difficult if you are supposed to do that in a world and in a context of which you actually don't really know how to define value to begin with. And I'm also very much following Randy here when he says, well, we have to be really careful. The one thing that frightens me most is the first doc. It's not number 2 or number 3. It's number 1 that comes along, because that's like blowing off an atomic bomb, not being able to carbon date anything anymore. So we have to get that one right. And getting that one right is, I think, probably the biggest problem we have at the moment, given all the caveats we already listed among us.
Great, a great set of comments, and I kind of like your observation that I guess we could each argue for who has the most incoherent healthcare system, whether it's the European Union or the U.S. But we could leave that perhaps to the happy hour, virtual happy hour later. Brian, you want to help us wrap up? I know you're a calm guy. You don't have much trouble sleeping, but interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, particularly as a retired guy. I think my thoughts are going to be similar to Anja, but I'll perhaps just say them in a slightly different way. Again, taking a payer perspective, what would keep me awake at night would be the realization that we have a promising new treatment in an area of significant unmet need and societal burden, but I can't support access to patients because there's just too much uncertainty regarding the value of the new treatment, or it's just not affordable. Payers have been under incredible challenges over the last 5 years. We're seeing pharmaceutical companies with robust pipelines of new, very innovative blockbusters, things like the gene and cell therapies, the CAR T cell therapies, immunotherapies, and other cancer drugs. Explosion of very high cost orphan drugs for treating rare and ultra rare conditions, and even in more common diseases, very expensive drugs to treat diabetes and migraine and common diseases. But we're also seeing patients and clinicians looking for early and equitable access to these promising therapies, putting pressure on governments to get that access. Regulators are listening. The European Medicines Agency, the FDA, and many regulators have instituted accelerated pathways, accepting lower levels of evidence to make their decisions, breakthrough pathways, priority reviews, and then some of these FRPs, the facilitated regulatory pathways, where countries are working together to make their decisions. And all of this has led to an affordability crisis at that payer level. And then add upon that what's happening currently this year with the COVID crisis and some of the economic challenges that countries all over the world are facing. So that's probably what would keep me most awake as a payer, but it's not all doom and gloom. In Canada, for example, we've been working on a 5-point plan to try and address some of these key challenges to ensure that we can provide patients access to some of these promising therapies. And I'd like to get into those a little bit later.
Great. Well, Brian, if somehow I neglect to come back to that, you can work it into any question that I ask, whether or not it's relevant. Just say what you need to say. So I, this touches a little bit on some of the commentary that several of you have made, but again, referring back to the recent advisory committee meeting for aducanumab held at the FDA, and as I imagine most of you know, there was a very positive review by the FDA staff, positive presentation, and a fairly broad, negative reaction from the advisory committee in terms of the strength of the evidence and the kind of magnitude of remaining uncertainties. So my question to each of you is, in your setting, and perhaps for European colleagues, imagine this same thing, something similar happening at the EMA, or just thinking about what happened at the FDA. I'm interested in your thoughts about the implications of the advisory committee discussion by itself, and then the hypothetically, should the FDA go ahead and approve aducanumab? How does that impact you as from your HTA payer, perspective, how does and maybe one of the questions you can answer is, could you imagine, as an HTA payer in your setting, not providing coverage or access in the setting of a positive regulatory decision? And just to offer an example of being willing to go out on a limb on this question, my personal view, having had some experience at CMS, as had Mike, is that an FDA approval of aducanumab would make it impossible for CMS not to provide access to the drug. There's lots of questions about the details about what that would look like, what mechanism would be used, national coverage, local coverage, other mechanisms, et cetera. But, even taking into account the advisory committee discussions and the nature of the underlying evidence and some of the questions there, a positive regulatory decision for CMS, in my opinion, would inevitably lead to coverage. But I'm interested in each of your thoughts on that, and maybe we could start with Mike. And any of you who feel like it is necessary for you to pass or have to go into witness protection, you're welcome to skip the question.
Yeah, so let's assume, Sean, that we have an FDA approval and CMS follows with some type of coverage decision, and now it is a covered drug. Where my head immediately goes is, oh my gosh, how are lower income Medicare beneficiaries going to afford this? If it's covered under Medicare Part B, as in boy, we have very significant cost sharing being put on the Medicare beneficiary. And we know, obviously, some of these beneficiaries, the very low income ones, will get that cost sharing covered by Medicaid. Some will get it covered by private Medicare Advantage plans. But we're going to have a lot of people who need the coverage who are going to look at the cost and consider it cost prohibitive. And that's where my worry immediately goes, is the coverage decision in, again, the fractured U.S. system with its weaknesses does not mean that everyone who would benefit from the drug will take the drug.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Brian, you up for going next on this one and speaking from the Canada perspective?
Yeah, I think if I was to see a positive recommendation or a decision coming out of the FDA based on what we're starting to see with the information in these clinical trials, I and the expert committees that we employ would probably look at this evidence and say, what do you want me to do with this? There's just not enough information on the value of this technology to allow us to make a positive reimbursement type recommendation. So it speaks to probably the first two components of our action plan. And the first of those is probably the most important. In order to allow us to make better downstream decisions at that payer level, or more important, at the clinician-patient interface, we need to collectively invest in doing more meaningful interactions upstream. Way upstream, pre-phase 3 clinical trials, pre-phase 2 clinical trials in many cases. So doing horizon scanning, payers hate surprises. They have budgets that they have to develop way ahead of time. So we need to be able to communicate what is coming, what's in the pipeline. And then we need to do scientific advice or early dialogues with the sponsors. We've developed that in Canada at our agency, where we provide that advice from an HTA payer perspective to manufacturers. We're doing that jointly with the regulator in Canada, with Health Canada, and we engage patients and caregivers in that as well. We ask them, what are the outcomes that are most important to you? So I think we need to get much better working together upstream. And then the second part of our action plan is there's so many stakeholders involved in getting a medication to patients. is we need to get much better at engaging all of the stakeholders in a very meaningful way. The sponsors in the clinical development, regulators from their benefit risk perspective, the frontline clinicians who are best to determine the place in therapy and integrating it into clinical practice guidelines, patients and their caregivers on the outcomes of importance, their values and preferences, quality of life issues, the HTA bodies who are looking at the comparative clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness and many other factors related to ethical considerations and implementation, and the payers from a budget impact perspective, price negotiation and decision making. Those are the kind of first two components of our action plan.
Got it. And Brian, follow up a little bit. The CAT has been doing scientific advice for a few years, and I believe have done some products in the Alzheimer's space. Do you have any reflections about, in the context of what we're talking about now, is sort of how, in what ways that's been, helpful or move things in the right direction, or how does it, how does it kind of, help us think forward, move forward in terms of these challenges?
Yeah, there's a number of organizations that have been doing this early dialogue from an HTA perspective. Probably the best known is the collaborative initiative between the European Union Network for HTA and the European Medicines Agency, and they've done numerous of these joint scientific advice or early dialogue sessions. And NICE has been probably the leader. They've been doing it the longest. We've been doing it for a number of years in Canada as well. But to answer your question, I think it's been incredibly helpful for the sponsors who are developing the clinical trial and the protocol to have a better understanding of what would be needed at that end state decision-making level by the payer. So what are the outcomes that we'd be looking for? What other factors are important in that clinical trial? The quality of life issues. What is the population? What are the comparators that need to be incorporated? And there's some good evidence through the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences. They've done some studies and surveys of companies that have actually been involved in these various scientific advice programs. So I think it is a growing field and a really important field.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Brian. And, just parenthetically, I'll say, you and I and others on this panel have been involved in the health technology assessment space for a lot of years. And one of the, I think, a positive development, in large measure, I think, led by the work at NICE and then picked up by ICER and many others, is, the amount of sincere engagement with stakeholders, industry, patient advocacy organizations, et cetera, and, opportunities for more dialogue and communication, which I think in some ways, helps ensure the kind of the richness and the perspectives that go into these health technology assessments, while at the end of the day, doesn't, completely eliminate, some of the differences in perspectives and conflicts. But I think it's been a very positive development. And I think the kind of work you're describing on early scientific advice is one example of that. So let's go to, on this issue we were talking about related to the impact of the FDA discussions and decisions. Anja, are you willing to take a swing at this one?
Yes, partly, I would say. For witness protection reasons, I'll keep it short on the regulatory side because it is under assessment at the moment. So I cannot talk about any of this. But what I can say is that it's one of my very first early dialogues, as a matter of fact, was on aducanumab. And the scientific advice had a particular program for a collaborative process with all developers in the Alzheimer field, which is unusual. We normally don't do that, but we did recognize that there's no isolated development in the field. So we used to have a couple of meetings with all the developers trying to unravel these problems, very similar to the roadmap initiative that was trying to understand where exactly we have to tweak the programs. When it comes to the FDA discussion, we are obviously very much aware of it. We follow it very closely. The fact is, it is not unheard of that EMA made a different decision than FDA. It's not very common, but we have to leave it to the assessors. They will look at the data in our usual way, which is different to the FDA. So the familiarity with the exact data sets and the involvement in the analysis is not comparable to what FDA has been doing. So we are more of a distant observer, I would say. That might explain why our position at the moment might be slightly different than some of the enthusiastic comments from the FDA. When it comes to the HTA, I must say I'm very much in Brian's corner. Honestly, knowing the data package, I see very little chance for reimbursement in Norway at the moment. Unfortunately, we have lots of drugs that are approved within the European system that are not reimbursed in Norway. And for very good reasons, because the simple fact is that we might be rich as hell, apparently, but we have a healthcare budget like everybody else. And when it's spent, it's spent. There's so much we can do with what we have. And we have a very, very strong underlying principle of fairness across the system, obviously. So we don't even count productivity. So whether you work or not work doesn't really matter, which means that all patients are supposed to be equal and all diseases are somehow to be treated equal. And I think that's very much in line what Diana would tell you, how we do this. So to deviate from that needs very good reasons. And that includes, for example, the famous topic of the caregiver costs that should be included in these models. This is not what we normally would do. We have lots of discussions ongoing around this because we are very much willing to understand that the question is very new and very different at the moment. But nonetheless, the framework in which we have to make decisions is a different one. And the uncertainty aspect counts a lot more in HTA decisions than it does in regulatory. Regulators are a little bit like good Christians, believing is enough. We are the atheists of the system. We want facts and anything else is not really counting. And then we start getting into this situation where I know the facts. I see lots and lots and lots of problems on the horizon. And I would not be surprised if there was a significant number of HTAs in Europe that find it extremely difficult, even if the FDA or even if EMA would approve it, to actually reimburse it for all the reasons that we already heard from Brian.
Well, thanks, Anja. I appreciate your being so forthcoming, and I realize now we should have had each of you sign a waiver form that you're taking your own risks, and CEOI is not responsible for any consequences. But with that in mind, Diana, any differences in or similarities in views to Anja or others?
No, I think it's quite difficult to comment because there's an ongoing appraisal process at NICE for aducanumab. So, but I think I kind of like to echo both Brian and Anja. So Brian's point about early engagement and that early dialogue is really, really important. And I completely agree that, in terms of developing that kind of evidence development strategy and package, that, we really need to be engaging in that really early stage if we're going to kind of get products that are can be assessed and then be reimbursed through our systems. And then I think with what Anja was referring to in terms of, all diseases are viewed equally and in order to be equitable, we need to sort of follow our existing methods and processes to review products. And in terms from a NICE perspective, we are the HTA body, we're not the payer. So I would imagine that the pressure would be more on NHS England as the payer in terms of, this could be a really expensive drug. So there may be some pressure on, for example, looking maybe at optimizing recommendations, looking at different subpopulations, subgroups. So where it's more cost effective, for example. We're used to dealing with highly specialised technologies through our existing programmes, so I don't see any need to kind of change existing methods for assessing these types of drugs. But I do think that, I can't comment on the evidence for this particular product, but I do think that obviously cost effectiveness is a really important issue for HTAs, and that's something that we would be looking at over and above what the EMA or the FDA would be considering within their review. So I'm So I'm not sure whether or not it would affect decision making by my organisation, to be perfectly honest. But obviously, I can imagine there being political pressure.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Randy, you're retired from Aetna, so no one can come back at you. So what's your perspective?
Sure. Well, it's one of the rules you might say is in America there are a great many payers, and if you've seen one payer, you've seen one payer. So there's going to be some variation here, but as a general rule, which I think is quite applicable, if there is no other disease-modifying therapy available, if it is FDA approved, and particularly if there's a national coverage determination by CMS, which is, by the way, binding on Medicare Advantage automatically, then it would be difficult for a payer not to approve it at all. In general, you're going to see this approved for payment under those circumstances, even if there is doubt about the underlying evidence. But that being said, there are different ways it can be approved for payment, and different ways it can be implemented. So if it is not something that is encouraged through data management and case management, the use might be somewhat limited within the group, and there may be pre-certification requirements which might relate to the FDA labeling, and which could be quite robust. So there's a world of difference between encouraging and limiting it in the way something is in fact approved, and you're likely to see a number of differences. In terms of my own former employee, if you have 20 million members, and that's not the largest health plan in America, the numbers are comparable to some national health plans in terms of total coverage. So it can be significant. Payers do in fact participate in America in this process, in the FDA and in CMS. And perhaps this could be somewhat more robust in terms of input, in terms of what kind of evidence we would generally like to see. But there are many different types of input and pressures that occur here. Maybe a somewhat more effective job can be done about taking this input and spreading it out amongst the large number of payers we have, which everything from small groups that don't do a comprehensive job of evaluation of new products themselves, to rather large organizations that study everything that comes out and produce determinations with justification, which in our case is open on the internet. Anyone can see it. So in general answer to your question, under the circumstance you described, you are very likely to see large-scale approvals, but the terms of those approvals could vary.
Gotcha. Okay, I got one more question for you, Randy. So it's a yes or no question. Easy. Let's say FDA approves aducanumab. CMS provides coverage through some mechanism, and the ICER review is insufficient evidence, which is not unprecedented. You're at Aetna. What do you do? Cover or not cover? Yes or no?
Well, first of all, as you know, I'm not at Aetna right now, but my interpretation would be that again, it would probably be approved for coverage under those circumstances, since it would be, if for no other reason, then it would be difficult not to. But effective implementation might require working with provider groups on encouraging it and supporting it, and a robust case management program to mine data to identify patients. And there's a good chance they would not engage in this sort of thing until more decisive evidence is available.
Okay, great. All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left, and we do have an audience question, which I think is a good one for us to comment on. As a theme that we've touched on through a number of your comments relates to, the inevitability with any product of important uncertainties at the time of regulatory approval that may be important from an HTA payer perspective. The question that came in was, would a persistent real-world evidence platform to track impact of aducanumab in populations using the drug be useful to payers and HTA organizations? And if so, how? So just any thoughts any of you have, if you'd like to offer on the potential role and value of real-world evidence, what it might have to look like in order to be useful from an HTA payer perspective. That's something, Brian, you'd be willing to start us off on?
So to me, to help us manage that uncertainty at product launch, which we would see with this product if the FDA gives it a positive market authorization, I think we need to take a life cycle approach, both at the regulatory level and at the HTA level. So with the early dialogue in that pre-market space, providing conditional market authorization and probably conditional reimbursement, and that condition is based on the collection of real-world data and whatever other emerging evidence we have on both safety and the effectiveness of the product. And that would then allow us to do a reassessment in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time of that particular drug on its real life safety and effectiveness. So I think it would be very beneficial to have a proper tool.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one? Anja?
Yeah, I think it's at the time of the launch, it doesn't really necessarily help us. That's the conundrum. It requires not just conditional, but it requires an adaptive process. And I think in Europe, we have a problem that most HTAs do not necessarily routinely reassess everything. So neither do we have a very robust experience with managed entry agreements. Some of us have rather poor track record when it comes to these kind of arrangements. They are complex. They are often time consuming. They might not deliver in the end what everybody has hoped for. So there is a certain problem with the full understanding what Brian is saying, that this is a life cycle thing. We are supposed to adapt some way along the way. The emerging evidence has to lead to something. But we all know that our systems are rigid as a brick. We are not there yet. As regulators, not, and also as HTAs, we are not there. We haven't really embraced this concept of saying, value, the famous value, changes also in time, because in time you can provide better or different evidence. And I think there is something where the system is not yet sufficiently prepared, I fear.
Thanks, Anja. Anyone else have a comment on this?
Sean, I'll just make a quick comment that real-world evidence permits us to think about value-based reimbursement, and certainly value-based reimbursement for drugs that have the long-term potential to improve outcomes and bend the cost curve is something we all embrace at the 10,000-foot level. The details are extremely difficult to work through, but at least real-world evidence allows us to have that conversation.
Great. Well, I see we're down to our last minute, so we're going to do the lightning round of 15 seconds wrap up. So I think what we decided the question was going to be is sort of what would be most helpful to you as an HTA payer for the community out there, the industry, patients, other stakeholders, to do that would help you do your job best in terms of future decision making on these AD therapies. So 15 seconds, we'll go, maybe we'll go in the original order. So we'll start with Mike and just run through everybody.
Obviously, some really good actuarial modeling on the impact of the drug, and in the broader sense, including the societal costs, including the caregiver costs.
Gotcha. And I think Randy, you're next.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, real-world evidence has been very helpful in many situations in which we're looking at implementation in milieu that are different from the way the studies were done. So, what would be very helpful would be to try and develop evidence in such a way as to match the way it can be implemented in the real world, including the appropriate subpopulations with what we're actually going to do and what we're actually going to implement, particularly long-term care data, which of course under these circumstances would be very difficult.
Great. Brian, you're up.
Two quick things. The first is I think we need to get out of our own silos and really, truly, meaningfully engage all of the stakeholders at all of the steps in the life cycle of a drug. But I think what's most important from an affordability perspective, a payer perspective, and this is a message to the sponsors in the audience, is we do need to start developing outcomes-based managed entry agreements where we pay for what actually works. And let's start getting more creative with our payment schemes. Whether it's subscription-based or pricing by indication or whatever it is. Let's get creative.
Perfect. Diana, last thoughts?
So I think having some real sort of clear sort of mitigation strategies about how we're going to mitigate against some of those uncertainties. So I think following on from Brian's comments about being creative, so thinking about new and novel ways that we can collect data. So using sort of wearables, for example, to collect some data that we might be able to use to sort of inform sort of our understanding going forward.
Fantastic. And Anja, last comment.
Yes, I can only say that important is bring us a realistic proposal. So don't promise us the stars. Bring us a model with the least uncertainties, and then trust us that we will do the best possible job we can do, because as a matter of fact, we are supposed to bring new drugs to the patients. We are enablers. We are not the guardians of the gate and trying to keep everybody out. But you have to give us what we need to actually do our job.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, what a fantastic panel. I really appreciate your being on this virtual event, and, hopefully, as they say, next year in Lausanne. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.